Thomas stood like a statue every morning as the pale light of dawn touched the palace gates. His posture was perfect, his back straight, his chin level. He wore a dark uniform that gleamed with careful polish. The brass buttons on his jacket caught the light in bright flashes. His boots were shined until they shone, and the soles made a crisp sound whenever he shifted his weight even slightly. Visitors rose in respect as they passed. Few dared even to look directly at him, for he exuded calm formality and quiet power. Each day began before the sun rose. Thomas left the small room where he slept, a simple space with a narrow bed and a wooden chair. He dressed slowly and with purpose. He smoothed every fold in his trousers. He adjusted the tall hat upon his head until it sat just right. The uniform he wore matched every rule and tradition of royal service. Thomas believed in rules. He believed in duty. He believed in honor. Yet beneath the crisp lines of his uniform, beneath the stiff jacket and the heavy boots, he carried a secret that belonged to a different life. He walked to the gate without speaking. The pathway was lined with stone walls that curved toward the palace entrance. Early birds chirped and the air smelled of fresh dew. Thomas paused at the designated spot and turned to face the road that led to the palace yard. His eyes were steady, scanning for any sign of trouble. He watched pedestrians, carriages, and palace staff as they approached. His face remained calm and neutral. He also watched their shoes to know if any guest might slip or stumble. He noted the way they stood, the way they held their parcels, the way they glanced at the palace walls. All of this he observed without blinking. No one knew that beneath the collar of his uniform, on the skin of his neck, he carried a bold tattoo. The artist had inked it years ago, in a time and place far from royal gardens and palace halls. Ink formed a curved pattern, lines and shapes that made sense only to those who shared the same secret. Thomas felt the faint raised edges of the tattoo whenever he tilted his head. It reminded him of nights spent under a foreign sky, of winds that carried strange languages and unfamiliar stars, of bonds that could never be named in public. He kept the collar tight to hide the mark. Rarely did he allow his hair to grow long, enough to cover it because he refused to lie about who he truly was. Slowly, day after day, his routine settled into a quiet rhythm. At exactly 15 minutes past 7, a pale blue sedan arrived to take the royal mail to the main palace office. Thomas watched it glide across the cobblestones. He marked the moment in his mind. At 8:45, he saw a group of school children on a field trip. Their guide spoke loudly as the children giggled and pointed at the tall guard. Families and tourists asked to take photographs. Thomas nodded politely, but offered no smile. A single flicker of his dark eyes was all he allowed. Then the tourists moved on, turning away as if they saw nothing unusual beyond a proud soldier in crisp attire. Inside, he felt the weight of expectations pressing on him. He must never flinch. He must never show fear. He must never reveal curiosity. He must never speak unless a matter of great importance demanded words. In his younger days, he had spoken often, laughed often too. Back then, the sky had felt limitless. I had trained hard, run through forests at midnight, and climbed mountains that chilled his bones. He had grown up with fellow warriors who became like brothers. They shared bread, water, stories, and silence under vast skies. He bore the scars of frostbite on his fingers and the ache of long marches in his legs, but he had carried pride in his heart. The tattoo had been a sign of that shared pride. It was a secret handshake inked in black lines. As morning moved toward midday, Thomas allowed himself a moment of thought. He noticed a small bird pecking at crumbs near the gate. A gray pigeon rested on the stone balustrade. They seemed fearless. In his presence, sometimes he wondered if he too could be free enough to perch at ease. But duty was stronger. Duty was what had brought him here. His family had known nothing of his past life. They only saw his medals earned in service of the crown. They only saw the stories printed in newspapers about his perfect service. They did not question his calm gaze or his silent strength. They did not wonder why he hardly spoke or why he never wavered when storms struck the palace grounds. A soft wind stirred the hem of Thomas's coat. Cloud passed over the sun, casting cool shade across his face. He heard the distant chime of the palace bell, calling the queen's carriage to leave for a public ceremony. He knew that in a few hours, the carriage would come through the same gate. The royal guard would shift positions, and he would hand over his post to a colleague. Then he would walk back to the barracks and enjoy a short rest before night duty began. At night, the palace seemed a different place. Shadows deepened, lanterns glowed, and footsteps echoed softly in empty corridors. He felt safer then. Fewer eyes watched him. He could for a moment feel the ghost of the man he used to be. Yet in all that calm, in all that stillness, Thomas felt a pulse of anticipation. He sensed change approaching like a distant drumbeat. He was not sure why. Perhaps it was the arrival of a new recruit, someone with bright eyes and fresh energy. Perhaps it was the quiet stir of history moving through the palace. Or perhaps it was the stir of something inside him, waking from a long sleep. The lines of his tattoo burned softly beneath his collar. They seemed to whisper that he belonged to more than one world. They seemed to remind him that one day someone might notice, and if they did, everything could shift in an instant. As the sun climbed higher, Thomas adjusted his stance and shifted his weight from one foot to the other. He placed his hands lightly at his sides. He scanned the crowd again. Each face was a story he would never know. Each person passed through without a second thought. He wondered if he was part of a story that had chapters hidden behind his uniform, chapters waiting to be discovered. Each breath he took felt slow and deliberate. Each moment he held still added to the quiet power he carried. The polished brass and the stiff uniform lay a man whose past had shaped him as deeply as any regiment or ceremony. At that moment, Thomas held his post with unwavering calm. He was more than a guard, was more than a servant of the crown. He was a man with two lives, one known and one secret. And though he stood alone, he was ready for whatever would come next. Whether dawn or dusk, sunshine or rain, he would remain. At his post, steady as a mountain. The palace gates might guard a queen, but Thomas guarded something hidden even from royalty, the story etched in ink upon his neck, waiting for the day it would shine in the light. Sarah stepped onto the palace grounds with a firm but graceful stride. She wore the crisp uniform of the Special Forces school where she had trained for 2 years. The bright morning sun reflected off her polished boots, and the soft clink of her belt buckle echoed in the quiet courtyard. She carried only a small satchel with her training notes and a canteen of water. Her hair was tied back in a neat bun, and her eyes were alert as she took in every detail around her. From the first moment she arrived, Sarah felt the old stones of the palace walls press in on her. She was used to wide-open spaces and hidden training camps in remote forests. Here, pillars soared overhead and carved lions guarded every corner. Palace staff hurried by in fine clothes, whispering about the queen's coming arrival. Tourists buzzed in small groups, snapping pictures of the tall guard standing at the gate. Sarah watched them all for half a minute, then turned her gaze. To him, Thomas stood motionless, as he did every day in his dark uniform. His eyes were set straight ahead, and his hands rested lightly at his sides. Sarah noticed the sharp line of his jaw, the steady calm in his stance, and the way the sun highlighted the curve of his hat brim. She saw the brass buttons on his jacket, the perfect fold of his trousers, and the gentle rise and fall of his shoulders with each quiet breath. He looked like any other royal guard, proud and fixed in place. But Sarah's Special Forces training had taught her to look beyond uniforms and polished boots. She watched as Thomas shifted ever so slightly, his eyes scanning the crowd. She noted the way he tracked the school children walking by, the way he seemed to read the smallest body language of every passerby. She recognized that sharp focus. From her own early days of Special Forces training, she had learned to spot a hidden weapon by the tilt of someone's hand, to read the tension in another soldier's leg, to see things most people missed. That same skill let her see more than the polished uniform and stiff posture of the palace guard. Sarah kept her steps calm as she approached the gate. She respected Thomas's post, and waited a respectful distance behind him. She followed the rules of the palace grounds: no abrupt moves, no loud voices, no unnecessary glances. But in her mind, she traced the guard's every detail. Then, in a single moment, Thomas turned his head just enough, and a thin line of skin appeared between the collar of his uniform and the edge of his hair. In that fraction of a second, Sarah saw the dark curve of ink peeking out. Her heart quickened. She froze for a heartbeat, though no one else seemed to notice. The tattoo was simple, yet striking a fluid curve and a sharp point, like a secret symbol from a brotherhood. Sarah knew it well. She had seen the same mark during one grueling exercise at Special Forces School when a visiting instructor wore it on his wrist. The symbol belonged to a covert unit, the kind of unit she would have joined if she had stayed longer inactive. Service, but life had taken her down a different path after her training ended. She had chosen to teach new recruits and help them find their own strength rather than stay in the field herself. The line of ink vanished as Thomas turned back to face forward. Sarah felt a quiet thrill of recognition. She stood very still, resisting the urge to check again. She reminded herself that she was here for basic guard training, not for secrets of the past. But she also knew that some secrets found you when you least expected them. Sometimes the smallest detail could change everything. After a moment, Sarah moved forward toward the training pavilion. She planned to meet the other recruits and begin her first lessons on palace protocol. She walked beside a high stone wall covered in ivy, her steps soft on the flagstones. The air smelled faintly of flowers from a nearby garden, and distant voices carried the polite hum of palace life. She felt both curious and cautious. The palace was a place of tradition, ceremony, and strict rules. Sarah had to learn to adapt, her sharp, forceful instincts to its gentle rhythms. Inside the pavilion, a small group of new recruits gathered around a long wooden table. They wore neat uniforms similar to Sarah's, though none had the ease of movement and the certainty in their shoulders that she had. An older officer introduced himself as Captain Ellis. He spoke with a warm, measured tone, welcoming them to the Palace Guard program. He handed out booklets on dress codes, marching drills, visitor etiquette, and emergency procedures. Sarah received her booklet with a nod and found a seat at the far end of the table. As the captain spoke, Sarah kept her eyes on him, but listened with only half her attention. Her mind drifted back to the moment at the gate. She reviewed every detail of the tattoo she had glimpsed. She remembered its shape, its smooth line curving into a sharp point. She wondered what it signified exactly and how Thomas had come to bear it. She let her eyes drift from the captain back towards the doorway, imagining she might see his tall figure again. After a brief introduction, the captain led the recruits outside for a marching demonstration. Sarah fell in line with the others and felt the weight of her satchel at her side. She practiced heel clicks and toe taps, perfectly in time with the captain's rhythm. But all the while, she watched the palace ground beyond the pavilion. Her senses felt stretched thin, like a taut wire waiting to hum. She told herself to focus on the drill, to learn every step perfectly. After all, she was here to train, not to hunt for clues. When the drill ended, the recruits formed a circle in the bright sunshine. Captain Ellis asked for questions, and several timid voices asked about dress code details and break times. Sarah remained silent, still processing the surprise of the tattoo. She understood that to speak now about secrets from Special Forces history would be both improper and dangerous. Yet she also felt an urge to learn more, to connect a piece of her own past to this quiet guard's story. She waited until the captain finished, and the recruits dispersed for a short break. Each new mariner of palace life took water from a stone, fountain, or reviewed notes under the shade of a tree. Sarah grabbed her canteen and leaned against the pavilion wall, out of the direct sunlight. Her breath fell into an easy rhythm as she closed her eyes for a moment. She imagined the nights spent training in the mountains, the bitter wind stinging her face. She remembered the unity of the old team and the symbol they had carried like a badge of honor. When she opened her eyes again, she saw Thomas on the path beyond the archway. He stood as still as a statue, but she could tell he had shifted his Wait, he wore the same starched uniform and polished hat, and the morning light glinted off his brass buttons. A small breeze teased at the hem of his coat. He looked like a figure carved from marble. Sarah took a sip of water, watching the guard from the shade. She remembered the flicker of the tattoo and felt her pulse steady but alive. Well, she needed to learn more, but she would not break protocol. She would not stare or approach him without reason. Instead, she planned to observe quietly over the coming days. She would watch his routine and note every detail, just as she had done in Special Forces school. She would respect the traditions of the palace and follow every rule perfectly. She would wait for the right moment to speak, if that moment ever came. For now, her presence here was to learn guard duties and palace ways. But Sarah felt a deeper purpose stirring inside her. Chance to connect with another soul who carried hidden pasts beneath a uniform of duty and honor. She finished her water and tucked the empty canteen into her satchel. She smoothed the front of her own jacket and straightened her shoulders. She joined the other recruits walking back to the pavilion, each step measured and precise. In her mind, she held a secret and a question, one that only Thomas could answer. And as she followed the path through the dappled sunlight, Sarah felt both the calm of palace life and the silent pulse of adventure waiting just beyond the gates. Thomas stood at his post as the early sun warmed the palace stones. His uniform looked perfect in the light. He held his head high and breathed slowly, feeling the weight of duty settle on his shoulders. He was used to many things: the sound of footsteps on cobblestones, the hush of visitors passing by, the faint echo of voices from inside the gates. But today felt different. He sensed someone watching him, not with suspicion, but with curiosity. Sarah approached along the wide path that led through the palace courtyard. She carried a small booklet and a pen meant for taking notes on palace rules and procedures. Yet her mind drifted back to the moment she had seen the tattoo on the back of Thomas's neck. She had rehearsed how to ask about it without breaking any rule. Now she walked calmly, her boots clicking softly on the paving stones. She stopped a respectful distance behind him and waited for his eyes to shift. Thomas felt her presence, but kept his gaze straight ahead. He felt the faint breeze lift the collar of his jacket, and in that instant, he remembered the symbol pressed into his skin. He held his breath, unsure if he should turn or stay still. His past felt heavy in his mind, like a memory that would not go away. Finally, he eased his hands from his sides and turned his head slightly. He saw Sarah a few feet behind him, her posture polite yet firm. "Excuse me, sir," she said softly. Her voice carried no challenge, only respect. "I hope I am not interrupting. I have a question about your uniform." He studied her face. The uniform she wore matched the recruits he had seen in the past days. She had learned to stand straight, to speak clearly, yet he sensed something more, an underlying confidence he recognized from another life. Thomas nodded. "You may ask," he replied, his tone calm but cautious. His voice sounded deeper than the words a guard normally spoke. He had practiced brief replies all his service life, but this felt different. He expected her to ask about parade rules or guard shifts. Instead, she asked the question he thought he would never answer. "I noticed a mark," Sarah said, her gaze steady on his face. "On the back of your neck? I wonder what it means." Thomas felt his heart quicken. He closed his eyes for a moment, recalling nights in camps and the faces of brothers he could never mention here. He breathed out and opened his eyes. His posture shifted from rigid to slightly relaxed. He had to decide whether to trust this young recruit. He lowered his chin and touched the collar gently to hide the mark. "Some things are private," he said quietly. "I do not show them to many." Sarah nodded, her pen poised. "I understand, but I have seen that symbol before. It belongs to a small group, those who served on Operation Silent Dawn." Thomas stiffened. He had not spoken. That name in years. How could she know? "You are from Special Forces training," he stated, more as fact than question. She offered a small smile. "Yes, I trained there for 2 years. We learned many things. That symbol was part of our code. I recognize it." Of relief and concern, he tapped his finger against his collar. "It is true. I served on that mission long ago. Few know. Even fewer spoke of it. Sarah took a step forward, careful not to crowd his space. You were in the field. You earned that symbol the same way I would have, maybe. Her words held no envy, only respect. She opened her booklet and held it in her hand like a shield of training notes. Yet Thomas saw the spark of genuine connection. In her eyes, he considered shutting down the conversation. Instead, he chose to share a piece of himself. He spoke slowly, each word chosen with care. Operation Silent Dawn took place in a remote region, far from here. We moved in darkness. We moved fast. I was part of a team that had to trust each other completely. We shared pain, hunger, cold nights. That mark was given to those who completed the mission. Sarah listened intently. She wrote nothing but watched his face as memories flickered across it. Thomas felt the old ache in his chest, the ache of longing for those days. For the camaraderie, for the open skies. He had buried that life beneath his royal duty. He had become the silent guard so no one would ask. No. Here was someone who asked, but with kindness. His voice trembled slightly as he spoke again. I wear this uniform now to serve a different purpose. Still, I remember who I was. Sarah nodded, understanding that service took many forms. A soft bird song drifted through the courtyard. A gentle breeze moved across the marble. Time seemed to slow. Sarah closed her booklet and tucked it under her arm. Thank you for telling me, she said quietly. It means a lot. Thomas gave a small bow of his head. You have the right to know, but you must promise to keep this private. She placed her hand over her heart and nodded. I promise. They stood in silence for a moment, two people from different worlds connected by a hidden past. Around them, life continued as usual. Carriage rattled by, and palace staff bowed as it passed. Tourists pointed their cameras at Thomas's post. None suspected the conversation happening at the gate, and guessed the bond forming in that instant. Thomas felt a weight lift slightly from his shoulders. He had not spoken of that time in decades, yet sharing the truth felt like releasing a breath he did not know he held. Sarah sensed his relief and offered a respectful salute. Shall I return to training now? She asked. Thomas nodded. Yes, you have duties to learn. I have duties to keep. We will meet again. She gave a polite smile and took a step back. Sarah turned and walked toward the training pavilion. She kept her steps calm, but inside her heart beat with excitement. She now knew more about the man she watched. She had found a mentor she could truly respect. She tucked the memory of his words into her mind, ready to carry them in the days to come. Thomas returned his gaze to the road. He raised his chin and smoothed his jacket. The collar felt tighter now that the secret was shared, but he felt stronger too. He knew that if Sarah honored her promise, she would carry his story safely. In turn, she would learn from his quiet strength. The palace gate felt both familiar and new as he stood at his post. Over the next hours, Thomas noticed Sarah's place among the recruits. He saw how she moved with controlled energy, how she kept her eyes open to every detail, how she treated every rule with respect. He felt a silent respect for her dedication. She had risked his trust by asking. She had also honored it by listening without judgment. As the sun began its arc across the sky, Thomas allowed himself a small thought. Perhaps this meeting was not a coincidence. Perhaps his path had led him here, to this palace, so that someone like Sarah might find him. Perhaps sharing a secret would lead to a deeper understanding between their two worlds. He scanned the courtyard again, ready for whatever would come next. When the royal carriage returned that afternoon, Thomas saluted with crisp precision. Sarah stood among the recruits in formation, her posture proud and straight. Their eyes met. For a moment, he offered a slight nod. She returned a respectful nod of her own. No words passed between them, yet each understood the bond that connected them now. Thomas knew that the palace would continue its routines, its ceremonies, its whispers. He would stand at his post and guard its gates. Yet, behind the collar, the tattoo beneath his skin no longer felt like a burden. It felt like a bridge between his past in his present. He had a new ally in Sarah, someone who saw beyond the uniform and into the history that shaped him. From that day on, whenever he felt the collar rubbed too tight, he would think of Sarah's understanding eyes. Whenever she faced a difficult drill or a confusing rule, would think of the guard who carried a hidden past and still stood firm in duty. Both held a secret bond and a promise to protect each other's trust. And in that bond lay a strength neither expected, but both welcomed. As they stepped into the next chapter of their service, the next morning, the palace grounds woke slowly. The sun rose behind the great stone walls, casting soft golden light on the gardens, the fountains, and the wide pathways. Birds sang quietly, and the smell of fresh flowers filled the air. The guards changed shifts, moving with quiet discipline. Staff members walked quickly, but respectfully. There was a rhythm in the palace, a calm and ordered flow that kept everything in motion. Sarah arrived early to the training area. She wore her uniform neatly, every button done, every line pressed sharp. Her boots were clean, her hair tied back just as the rulebook said, but her mind was not only on training drills today. Her thoughts kept returning to the quiet conversation she had shared with Thomas the day before. She had not told anyone. She had kept her word. Yet inside, something had changed. She no longer saw the palace the same way. She now knew that behind the uniforms and traditions, there were real stories, real people, real memories hidden deep inside, men like Thomas memories. Not shown to the public, not written in books, but held close to the heart. She felt honored that he had shared even a piece of his past with her. She promised herself again she would never break that trust. As she stood in line with the other recruits waiting for their instructor to arrive, she spotted Thomas across the courtyard. He was already in position, standing at the gate with his usual stillness. From a distance, he looked the same as always, tall, proper, quiet, but Sarah now noticed the small details more. The way he adjusted his coat exactly every 15 minutes. The way his eyes moved quickly from person to person, always watching, always ready. She saw the soldier under the surface. Their eyes met for just a second. No words, no gestures. But that small glance felt powerful. It was like they understood each other in silence. Two people from very different paths, now quietly connected. Training that day focused on alertness and posture. Captain Ellis walked between the lines of recruits, correcting arm angles, foot placement, and eye direction. He spoke in a steady tone, never too harsh, always firm. Discipline shows respect, he reminded them. A careless stance is a careless mind. Sarah listened closely and followed every command, but her thoughts drifted now and then, not because she was distracted, but because she was thinking deeper. She now understood how important it was to carry one's past with dignity, just as Thomas did. Later that morning, the recruits were given a short break. Sarah walked to the far side of the garden, where benches lined the stone path. She sat in the shade of a tree, letting the breeze cool her skin. She drank from her water bottle and opened her small notebook, pretending to read, but her eyes watched the path near the gate. She saw Thomas standing calmly, just like always. She thought about his story, the silent mission, the symbol on his neck, the promise to protect something greater than himself. A few minutes passed, and to her surprise, Thomas stepped away from his post. Another guard replaced him. He walked slowly but purposefully toward the garden path. Sarah sat still, unsure if he was coming her way. But as he approached, her heart beat a little faster. He stopped a few steps from her bench. "May I join you for a moment?" he asked politely. "Of course," Sarah replied, sitting straighter. Thomas sat down at the edge of the bench. Didn't look directly at her at first. I watched the sky, the way the clouds moved, the soft rustling of leaves above them. "I wanted to thank you," he said after a short pause. Sarah turned to him, surprised. "For what?" "For not speaking of what I shared," he replied. "For showing respect." She smiled gently. "You trusted me. I won't break that." He nodded. "Still, trust is hard to come by. In the past, I served with people who vanished the next day. You never knew who would return. That kind of life makes you careful. Quiet." "I understand. Not in the same way, but my training. Taught me the value of silence, too. They sat quietly for a while, the sounds of the palace drifting around them. Footsteps, soft voices, the ringing of a distant bell. Then Thomas spoke again, this time in a softer voice. Many think guards only stand still, but we see everything. We feel the changes even when no one else does. Sometimes we carry stories that don't fit in with the golden halls. Sarah nodded. I've started to notice that. The palace looks beautiful, but there's so much underneath. Like your story. Thomas turned slightly and looked at her. You remind me of someone I once served with. Same sharp mind. Same quiet strength. He didn't speak often, but when he did, everyone listened. Sarah smiled a little. That's a big compliment. Thank you. Thomas looked thoughtful. You asked me what the symbol meant, but you already knew. You saw it. You felt the weight of it. That's rare, I think. Sarah said slowly that people like us, we recognize each other. Even in silence, Thomas gave a small nod. Yes, we do. A few moments later, the bell rang again. The next shift would begin soon. Thomas stood up, smoothing his coat. He turned to Sarah one last time before returning to duty. You'll go far here, he said. Not because you follow the rules, because you understand what they mean. Sarah looked up at him, her eyes steady. Will you ever tell others your story? He shook his head. Maybe not, but I'm glad I told you. Then, without another word, he walked away. He moved like a man who had made peace with his past, even if it still lived inside him. Sarah watched until he disappeared beyond the archway. She felt a mix of emotions: respect, curiosity, inspiration. That afternoon, training ended earlier than usual. Sarah returned to her small room, removed her jacket, and sat by the window. She could see part of the palace wall and the far end of the courtyard. She thought about the many guards who stood in silence, each carrying their own story. She thought about Thomas and how one symbol had led to something bigger, a bridge between generations, between roles, between quiet souls. She picked up her notebook and turned to a blank page. Instead of training notes, she wrote something new. True strength is quiet. It does not need to shout. It stands tall. It watches. And it waits for the right moment to be known. She smiled softly and closed the book. Tomorrow would bring more drills, more commands, more rules. But Sarah now walked through the palace with a deeper understanding. She would never look at a uniform the same way again. Was Thomas just a quiet royal guard to most would forever remain in her memory as the man who carried two lives, both noble in their own way? And somehow, she knew this story between them was not yet over. The next few days passed quietly, but something had changed between Thomas and Sarah. They didn't speak again in public, but every time they saw each other across the palace grounds, there was a silent nod of understanding, a glance that meant trust, a look that said, I remember. While the palace followed its daily routine, guards standing still, tourists taking photos, and staff moving from room to room, Sarah and Thomas carried something unspoken between them. Sarah continued her training with full focus. She followed every command from Captain Ellis, practiced marching with her fellow recruits, and studied the palace rulebook every evening. But her eyes saw more now. She noticed the older guards who stood with heavy eyes. She noticed the young ones who walked quickly, trying to prove themselves. She even saw the staff, the kitchen workers, the gardeners, the cleaners, and wondered what stories they carried inside them. The palace was filled with people who had given something of themselves to serve quietly, just like Thomas had. One evening, as the sun began to set and the shadows grew long on the palace walls, a special event was announced. The Queen was hosting a private dinner to honor long-serving palace staff. Only a few guards would be allowed near the dining hall, and Thomas was chosen to stand at the entrance that night. Sarah wasn't part of the assigned team, but she asked Captain Ellis if she could observe the evening duty from a distance. He allowed it, as long as she remained quiet and respectful. She arrived near the main hall just before sunset. The palace was glowing with golden light, and lanterns had been lit all along the walkway. Everything looked magical: clean floors, polished railings, and flowers placed carefully near each pillar. Guests in fine clothes entered the hall, smiling and chatting. The guards stood proudly by the door, and at the center of them was Thomas, still and calm, just as always. From a quiet corner behind a curtain, Sarah watched him. His eyes scanned every face that passed. He didn't move unless needed, but she noticed how his jaw tightened when older veterans entered the room. These were men and women who had served for decades, some with canes, others with silver medals. One of them stopped in front of Thomas and gave him a long, meaningful look. Thomas gave a small nod. No words were spoken, but the exchange said everything. They knew each other. Perhaps from a time long before the palace. As the evening went on, Sarah saw Thomas shift slightly. His hand moved up to his collar, as if the tattoo underneath it had started to itch again. It wasn't a physical itch. It was memory, feeling. Something stirred in him, something that wanted to come to the surface. An hour passed. The guests enjoyed their meal. Music played softly in the background. Sarah was just about to leave when she saw a small boy run down the hallway, chased by his laughing mother. They were not guests. They were likely family members of one of the honored staff. The boy ran close to Thomas and then stopped to look up at him. "Are you a soldier?" he asked, his eyes wide. Thomas didn't answer right away. Then slowly, he looked down and gave the boy a kind nod. The boy smiled. "You look strong." Thomas gently replied, "Sometimes strength is being still." The mother arrived, slightly out of breath. She gave an embarrassed smile and thanked Thomas for not being angry. He simply nodded again, and they walked away. But the moment stayed. With Sarah, she had heard the words too. Sometimes strength is being still. It was a quiet truth, but a powerful one. The next morning, Sarah had her final training review. Captain Ellis tested each recruit on discipline, attention, posture, and movement. When it was her turn, she passed every step. Her eyes stayed forward. Her body moved in perfect time. Her answers were clear and respectful. After the review, the captain pulled her aside. "You've done well," he said. "But what sets you apart isn't just your training, it's your understanding. You observe people. You respect silence. That's rare." Sarah thanked him and went to sit on a bench near the training grounds. She thought about what he had said. Then, as if drawn by the thought, she looked toward the far end of the palace gate and there was Thomas. Not at his usual post, but walking toward her. He wasn't wearing the full formal uniform now. He still looked neat and strong, but more relaxed. He stopped beside her and gave a polite nod before sitting down. For a few moments they said nothing. Then Thomas spoke. "I'm retiring soon," he said softly. Sarah turned to him with surprise. "Really?" He nodded. "This will be my last week here." Quiet breeze passed between them. Sarah didn't know what to say at first. Finally, she asked, "Do you feel ready?" Thomas looked at the trees swaying gently in the wind. "I think so. This place has been good to me. But there comes a time when you must pass the duty on to someone else." Sarah felt something heavy in her chest. "Taught me more than anyone else here, without really trying." Thomas gave a small smile. "Sometimes the best lessons come quietly." She looked at him, wanting to say more, wanting to ask if he'd miss it, wanting to ask what he'd do next. But instead, she said, "Will you ever tell your full story?" He looked thoughtful. "Maybe not in words, but in how I've lived." "Perhaps yes." They sat in silence again. Two people from different times joined by respect. Then Thomas stood. "Your training is complete now, but the real work begins after." Sarah nodded. "I'll do my best." "I know," he said. "You already are." With that, he walked away. No ceremony, no goodbye speech. Just quiet steps on an old stone path. A week later, Sarah stood at the palace gate in full uniform. Her posture was straight. Her eyes were focused. Her jacket was neat and her boots shined in the morning sun. She stood where Thomas used to stand. Tourists passed. Visitors nodded politely. Children pointed and whispered. She didn't move. She just stood tall, watching the world with silent care. Somewhere far from the palace, Thomas sat on a park bench, watching the birds. His collar was loose now, and the tattoo on his neck was partly visible. He no longer had to hide it. He wore it with quiet pride. A nearby boy stared at the mark and asked, "What's that?" Thomas smiled gently and said, "It's a story, a quiet one." And in that moment, both Thomas and Sarah stood in different places, but held the same strength. One had passed on the duty, the other had received it. And between them there was a bond that didn't need words to last.